So it's time to mold the collector's hand. Once again, we start by sealing it with 3 light coats of matte spray and letting it dry completely. Next, we haze it with a light coat of mold release, which will help later when removing the clay from the mold. Now before we get into this mold, I recommend you watch our last video for a full tutorial with detailed descriptions of some of these steps. Alright, for the hand we will be doing a 2-piece mold. So first I draw a dotted line with a Sharpie as a guide for the clay divider wall and the part line for our mold. I also use some wood, styrofoam, and bubble wrap to make a bed to lay down our sculpture. This also creates a platform to build our clay wall on. Next, I cut some small slabs of wet clay and start creating the divider wall. I just quickly work my way around the sculpture, building it up to our dotted Sharpie line. And it doesn't have to be pretty, we will clean it up later. I use a tool to get into spots like between the fingers, and again, just quickly build a rough mass of clay right up to our part line. And here's our rough clay divider wall. It should always be as level and perpendicular to your sculpture as possible, and in most cases, it should be dividing your sculpture perfectly in half. Next, we start to clean it up using a spatula to smooth out the majority of the surface. Then we very carefully use a spatula and dental tools to just nudge and push the clay very gently right to the dotted line on our sculpture. Then we use a brush and a little water to clean up the clay wall where it meets the sculpture. This is a very tedious but extremely important step. You want to carefully push that clay nice and tight up against your sculpture, but without gouging into it. The cleaner this edge is, the cleaner your seam lines will be on your latex castings. So really spend the time to make this connection clean and tight. It is very important that you don't have any gaps at all, or the plaster will leak between the wall and the sculpture. So I continue to go around with a brush, smoothing the clay wall and cleaning the seam line. With a wet brush, you can clean off any wet clay that got gunked up on your sculpture. So next, I trace a line to define the edges of the mold. And then using the spatula, I cut some clean, flat edges around our clay wall and peel back the clay. I make a quick scribe line for the top of the mold, and now it's time to make our registration keys. Registration keys are these male and female shapes on the flange that lock together to align both halves of the mold. There are many ways to create mold keys. You can pour silicone into an ice cube tray, you can use acrylic domes and push them into your clay wall, glass cabochons work great. There are many objects that can work for keys, they just have to have draft and no undercuts. Pretend this is our divider wall. You can just push some domes into the clay like this, or you can even take some tools with a round end and push it into the clay like this. All of these methods can work great. But if you don't have anything to use for keys, here is a quick and dirty method that'll get the job done. Use a simple loop tool like this, stick it into the clay about a ½ inch, and spin the tool, cutting out a little keyhole. On a mold this size, I do about 8 keys a few inches apart, and always keep your keys centered on your clay wall. Now I just use my finger, water, and a brush to smooth them out and make sure they are beveled with no undercuts. And here's our finished clay divider wall with the registration keys. Alright, now I cut some larger slabs of wet clay to build a mold box. I just attach these pieces right to that nice clean edge we cut around our clay wall. These will act as retainer walls for the hydrocal and really simplify this mold process. I add some small support pieces of clay to the outside and blend the walls together. Here's the finished clay mold box. Basically, I'll be creating a 2-piece block mold. The walls are about a ½ inch taller than the sculpture, so I can fill it up with hydrocal. The PVC will become our pour spout in the mold for when we're casting latex. And the thumb I specifically sculpted with no armature so that it won't lock into the mold. The majority of the hand sculpture will pull out of the mold first, and then the thumb will slide out of the mold separately. Alright, let's do this! I mix up my splash coat of hydrocal and start to apply it over the whole sculpture, working it into all the details. Again, please check out our last video for an in-depth description of these steps. I keep covering the sculpture and building it up as the hydrocal thickens. And I make sure to brush it up the walls a bit too. And now that it has a good first coat, we allow it to cure for a while. Next, we mix up our second batch of hydrocal and wet down the entire surface of the first layer. Then we add a few layers of hemp, wet those down, and massage out any air pockets. And then we just fill up the mold box with hydrocal. Once it's had time to fully cure, we then pull off the clay walls all the way around. Next, I use a sculpting tool to knock off the sharp top edge. Then very carefully, we flip over the entire thing and remove the wood, the styrofoam, and the bubble wrap. Then I very carefully start to remove the clay divider wall. Always pull the clay away from your sculpture. It should all lift away very easily. And there's the first half of our mold. Now, let's prep it for the second half. I prop it up on some wood and clay and then start to clean the flange. I just use water, a toothbrush, and paper towels to clean up the majority of the clay residue. Just be very careful not to hit your sculpture. I also use some soft brushes and water to clean any clay residue off of the sculpture. Next, I apply Vaseline to the entire hydrocal flange so that the second half of the mold does not bond to the first half. This is an extremely important step. It should look all glossy and wet like this when you're done, with every bit of the flange covered in Vaseline right up to your sculpture. Next, we cut some little squares of clay and add them in 3 spots at the outside edge of the flange. These will become pry spots for opening our mold later. And then once again, we build a clay mold box around the mold like this. And now we're ready to repeat the steps and create the second half of the mold. So now we mix up the hydrocal and start brushing on our splash coat, getting it into all the details and covering the flange, the keys, and the pry spots really well. We build up a nice, thick first layer covering everything, including the side walls. Once it's cured a bit, we mix up the second batch and wet down the first layer. Then again, we add our hemp layers and massage them in. And then just fill it up with hydrocal. Now that it's had time to completely cure, let's open it up. We remove the clay walls and then carve off the sharp edge on top with a sculpting tool and clean up the sides a little with a Sureform. Remember our little clay square pry spots? It's time to use them. I just take a screwdriver, push it in, and slowly pry it. You should immediately see the part lines separate, and then you can just lift off the top half. And because we use mold release, the clay lifts right out, easy and clean. And here's our finished 2-piece block mold. I washed the clay residue off with some water, and it turned out super clean. Now you can see our registration keys, our pry spots, and the pour spout that the PVC created. And even the clay for the thumb popped right out nice and clean. Overall, it turned out pretty good, and now it's ready for some latex. And just like the head mold, I made sure the bottom was flat so that it would sit upright when casting the latex. Well, we really hope you are enjoying these tutorials. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.